Hello, everyone. Welcome to Real Talk Food Safety with Tia and Jill. We are excited to have you here.
We are welcome to another Wednesday of Real Talk. And as you can see, we have a guest this week.
We
We're so
do.
excited to have Ben with us. Hi, Ben.
Hello, Jill. Hi, Tia. How are you?
Hi, great. We are excited to have you on the show today because we're talking about everyone's favorite topic, food safety culture.
Right. Doesn't this seems to get so much traction? Like, how long has it been since Frank wrote the books? 10 years, 12 years, whatever it is. And it was still conversation before that as well. But now everybody, it seems, is at that point of like, how do we actually do this?
Yeah.
How do we do it like every day, every week, every month?
Yeah. It's something that I think industry is talking about, academia is talking about, right? We're talking about, right? How to even support industry. And so it is top of mind and a relevant topic for Real Talk Food Safety.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And not only are we, but like everybody out there who's joining us, thank you to the audience because this must be on your mind as well. Absolutely. Or you just saw that we have Ben on and you're like, I'm gonna come on joining the show today since Ben's here. And we love that too.
That is true. So put in the comments, say hello to us. Let us know where you are watching from. And then definitely add in the comments, are you here to see Ben?
No, you don't have to do that. It's good to be with you both. I think we had a chance to get to know each other a little bit better at this last IFP this summer in Toronto. And I think, like you said, food safety culture is top of mind. Certainly it was heavily on the agenda there in July. So good to be with you this morning. I appreciate the chance to join the conversation.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for being here. And you're right, like we got to know each other a little bit more doing IFP. And like you said, it's because food safety culture is top of mind. And we've been doing work in food safety culture, particularly in the applied practice of food safety culture, where you all are tracking down how do you measure food safety culture and get people to understand where are they at. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that during the show. But it seems like you all are also having tons of conversation around what is food safety culture and how do we measure it, which will be relevant to today's conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think it also points out just the power of connections in person. Yeah. Because like Ben, right, like I've known your name for a long time, but we had never met in person. And so it's so fun to go to a show and be like, we actually get to put faces and names together and have like live conversation. And then boom, look, a few months later, here we are together.
Here we are.
Yeah,
Hello from Birmingham in Nigeria. Welcome. We want to hear your perspective. So hopefully we'll be able to see your comments. So please put your comments in. We will refer to them. We want to hear your perspectives. Put your questions in there as well. We will try to address them while we're on the show.
Absolutely.
And if you've never been here with us before, I'm Tia, this is Jill, and we are co-founders of Catalyst. And Catalyst, we are all about culture because we are all about people. What we do is we help transform how people lead in food. And the reason why we're in this space is because we want leaders to show up where they are living authentically and achieving more in their day-to-day and at their organizations, and ultimately enabling business growth. You know, food safety and quality, we are business partners and we too want the organization to succeed, right? Which I know we get in those conversations. We've had those conversations here on the show of, you know, how does food safety and quality contribute to the bottom line? We do if you're using us right, and if you are equipping us with the right leadership skills. And so we help organizations get their people there.
Yeah. I think it's one of those things, even as we talk about food safety culture, like we all know policies and programs don't get us to that place where we're like, we're all on the same page of what we do and we're investing and we're influencing and we're really setting everybody up for success as well as we want to. And that's really where the people side comes in, which is why Tia and I are in this space because to enable the outcomes we want from all the programs and policies that we support as technical experts, we've got to be better leaders.
Yeah, we like to think
even the
about,
best leaders, we still need brush ups and tune ups.
oh yes, oh yes. You know, we kind of think about like food safety culture. We have to be great at the technical stuff. We also have to be great at leadership, right? And then we need to integrate that into our business. And then as you work on food safety culture, right, like with those two things, we can drive food safety culture forward. Without one or the other, right? Like you can have great leaders, but if you don't have the technical skills, or if you have the technical skills, but you don't have great leaders, right? It's going to be difficult to get to the food safety culture you want to get to, because food safety culture is about food safety technical and culture people. We know people like to leave out the culture people side, which is where we play. So we're happy to be here and talking about one of our favorite topics.
And that's why we have Ben.
Yeah.
Right? Because Dr. Ben Miller, you've been in many different spaces and bring different perspectives in the work that you've done, and even a little bit different on how we look at food safety culture. So I can't wait for our audience to learn more.
Good. Well, great to be with you. Yeah, looking forward to the conversation.
Well, you know, we often like to start with having people even know a little bit more about you. So what if we start there? So for people who don't know you and this is maybe their first time meeting you, can you share a little bit about your background and like what led you to here?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, we'll jump in the Wayback Machine and go back to
Once upon a time. No.
Right.
Once upon a time in the early 2000s, there was a graduate student. So I started my career in public health actually working on Team Diarrhea, which some people may be familiar with. So at the state of Minnesota, it was kind of a unique program that was started in the mid 1990s that used graduate students at the University of Minnesota in the School of Public Health to do foodborne illness interviewing to solve outbreaks. So that was right about the time when, for those kind of outbreak aficionados out there, that pulse field gel electrophoresis, or PFGE, that's how we called it back in the day, was coming into vogue, and that really allowed epidemiologists to look at clusters of illness in a way that we couldn't before. You know, in the mid 80s, if you had a salmonella outbreak, you might know the serotype, but you didn't know like how related those salmonella isolates were to each other from human cases of illness. So as lab methods kind of matured, there was a recognition by several really smart folks at the Department of Health and the University of Minnesota, one of which was my PhD advisor, Dr. Craig Hedberg. So he and some others kind of created a group at the health department that would focus on foodborne illness interviewing using graduate students. So my first foray into public health was picking up the phone and trying to call for controls for case control investigations. So we would literally look at a person's phone number, take the first 6 digits, and then just start random dialing the next 4 digits to try to find somebody that we could use as a control for that particular outbreak investigation. So you really had to, you can imagine when you call somebody calling from the health department, would you like to talk to me about any potential gastrointestinal issues you had in the last 2 weeks?
I'm like, and such organized crank calling, you know, like nowadays with cell phones, nobody probably gets the crank calling thing, but right, like I'm with you because, well, I know what that's like. I love it. Part of Team Diarrhea was crank calling and
exactly. Yeah, exactly. So, you know, I've been told I have a voice. I think I've got a face for radio, but I definitely maybe have a voice. So it sounded credible on the phone when I was calling. I was usually lucky. I think, you know, we would have contests and who could get it. And I think I got, you know, somebody on my second call. So I was like,
nice. Nice.
Anyways, long intro. But so I actually started my career as an epidemiologist. And so in some ways that I think 20 years later informed sort of the way that I started to think about food safety culture. But in between that, I worked as an epidemiologist, and I was the director and kind of oversaw the human and animal food inspection programs for the state of Minnesota, worked closely with FDA. We kind of reorganized the way that we did regulatory work to more align with the Food Safety Modernization Act in the early 2010 period. And so I directed the food program, and then all of the division's programs for about 8 years at the state of Minnesota before I joined the Atchison Group back in 2018. So my background kind of before coming into the consulting and kind of private industry side of the world was in public health and food safety regulation. So, I had an opportunity when I was at the state to have a division that had about 110 just regulatory and professional level staff. And so I think we didn't call it food safety culture, we kind of called it different things. I think having the name food safety culture is actually really helpful because it kind of grounds people in at least a space, right? Like we kind of start to know what we're going to be talking about when we're using that language. Although, what exactly are we talking about? That's where the nuance comes into play. And I think that's what we'll have conversation about today. And I know we're going to do a webinar here in the next week or so, that it's going to dig into more detail around that. But for me, coming out of kind of managing people and then moving towards the industry side, food safety culture was really starting to kind of take off within that time frame. Obviously, you mentioned Frank had written his book and published that back in, I think, 2009. That momentum was building, but I think, when we look at the peer-reviewed literature, like a lot of stuff really started getting published kind of in the mid-2010s, like 2015, 2016, 2017. So we saw more research out there that started to put meat on the bones, if you will, of sort of what is food safety culture and how do you define it. So being an epidemiologist by training, for me, it's about data, right? Like I'm like, as an epidemiologist, you're looking at like exposures, associations, and outcomes. And there's something that's happening in between. And you're trying to figure out like, what is that's happening in between and how do we measure it? And, if you can measure it, you can then see if interventions are working, do things change, do rates go down? In an outbreak investigation, what's the association between a particular food and how many people got sick versus people that didn't eat that food? So, it's bringing essentially math and structure to real world problems. And I think for me, I was a little skeptical at first with, to be honest, when, food safety culture, I'm like, it's kind of squishy. Like, what is that? Really, I mean, we had conversations internally at the tag. It's like, when I say those words, what do you think I'm saying? And it wasn't until I think we sat down and kind of collectively went through, kind of did our own literature review to say, okay, like let's start to center around what some of the best thinking is in this space. And I think by coming up with kind of a common thought model and common definitions, it gets us to a place where we can start, when we're talking about assessment, start talking about what are we looking at? What are some of the components that go into defining food safety culture, but then also how do we quantify that in ways that allow us to sort of measure the things that we want to do to change food safety culture to, right, improve it. And I think that's obviously where the conversations we had this summer, were really intriguing to me because we work really, I think, primarily on the assessment side of the ledger. And then it kind of moves more into the space that, the Catalyst is in. And that's, I don't want to me, I'm thinking about that in terms of, organizational development, coaching, leadership, it's the things that the resources that we give to people ultimately to be more successful. And that, is a key portion of bending kind of the curve when we think about or maturing, the culture within an organization. I mean, there's other things that go into that. You mentioned kind of the technical pieces and things like that. And that's certainly a component of it. But, for me, the first step always starts with, and again, this probably goes back to my training, it starts with measuring it. So let's define where we are, and then let's figure out, if we're doing things differently, is that having a positive or negative effect on kind of where we are?
Yeah.
That's, even saying those things, it's an oversimplification, I think, of the complexity when you're talking about people.
Mhm.
Are hard to measure, right? Like, because I think that gets to a little bit of what we're talking about in terms of culture versus climate.
Yeah.
Because when we think about culture, it's sort of, I'm going to read from a slide here because I like definitions, but I think one good definition is it's the aggregation and prevailing, relatively constant, learned, shared attitudes, values, beliefs, contributing to the hygiene behaviors within a particular food handling environment. So it's a thing that exists, and I think that culture always changes, but
Mhm.
I think sometimes we view it as, I don't want to say static, but
Yeah.
that it's almost kind of monolithic. And again, that's probably not the right word, but when we start to think about climate, for me, that's more of how does the individual feel sort of
Mhm.
as an entity or as a member of that culture. And obviously, how individuals feel has a direct effect on culture. And so
Right.
the way a person can feel can vary from, point A to point B in time as
Mhm.
well. So it's kind of having to put all that into a pot, stir it up, and figure out, kind of what
Yeah.
does that all mean.
Yeah.
But we've really spent quite a bit of work, over the last 5 years trying to figure out, align with kind of best practice in the peer-reviewed literature and come up with what we feel like is a sound approach to
Mhm.
assessment, defining where somebody sits, on a maturity model scale. So
Yeah.
long introduction, sorry, but
No, no.
Yeah, I think that's great. And one of the things that, one of the things as you started talking about food safety culture that stood out to me is that, like, in the beginning, it felt squishy, right? And even as we tried to, because we do have those technical minds, right? Like, we do try to figure out, okay, what is the formal definition? And so we're all talking about it the same way. And then how do we measure it? But what we find is that there's still some squishy stuff in there, right? The word culture itself should make us feel a little squishy, because
Mhm.
that means we are talking about people, and people, we're squishy. Like, we are, right? Like, sometimes we're trying to be data focused, right? But there's these squishy elements of it where we have to figure out how do we incorporate those things and work on those things, because like you said, how a person is feeling one moment to the next, anything can kind of move a person, right? It could be someone said something and I took offense by it, right? And now I might fill out a culture survey a little bit differently than if someone said, wow, Tia, like, you're doing so great on this project. We're so happy to have you on the team. And then I'm like, you know what? This culture is great. So my culture survey might be a little different. So
Mhm.
as we look at culture, I think you're right in the sense of, like, we have these technical pieces, right, that we have to figure out, like measuring it, so that we could talk about it, right, collectively. And then we also have to remember the squishy part of just being humans, that we have to incorporate as a part of culture.
Yeah. Well, and Ben, I know as you were kind of walking us through that, one thing that stood out is you talked about, like, that your group has been really looking at this for like 5 years
Yeah.
or maybe even more. And I'm curious because there may be a few people too who are like, they're just meeting you. They're curious, like, what is TAG, and what was it that started you on the path of looking at food safety culture, and what are some of the things that you discovered as your group was doing all of this research and this background, and really kind of diving into that to say, how do we learn about this so people can gauge where they're at to know where they need to spend more time.
yeah.
And I just stacked like 4 questions in there, so you can choose the
I
ones you
caught 'em
want.
all. Like, I'll take them, in no particular order, right? No, it's a good question. So TAG, or the Atchison Group, was started. We just celebrated our 10-year anniversary. So started by Dr. David Atchison, who was Associate Commissioner of Foods at FDA in the late 2000s. So he was really uh, very much involved in the development of FSMA, right? So kind of thinking about what is that new regulation going to look like. So a lot of what was written and ultimately became law. And FSMA, David had a part in. So he's got fingerprints on the food safety community in a lot of different ways. And for the first probably 5-ish years of TAG's existence, a lot of the support that the company provided, and before I joined, was thinking about compliance relative to FSMA rules as they came out. So we think about, again, some of those technical pieces in terms of preventive controls and how do I do a hazard analysis and what do I need to do to be compliant in these spaces. So again, to bring it back a little bit to food safety culture, probably one of the best models that I've seen, and this is something we'll dig into a little bit more in the webinar that we do next week, is that we look at those food safety management systems that exist, and those are kind of those are the written programs, those are the technical pieces, those are written processes. It's getting those things set up right. I mean, obviously that's foundational to being able to do food safety well, and so I think, again, those first 5 years of the existence of TAG, and really, and the food industry was rightly focused on those compliance pieces, like, hey, do I need an environmental monitoring program? I mean, I remember being part of conversations as the agency was figuring out what it wanted in the regulation when I was at the state. Should we require an environmental monitoring program, for example, in a food processing facility, for ready to eat foods? And so, at the time, being a regulator, I was like, absolutely, and but I think it's the right approach too. I mean, from just a public health and kind of food protection and food safety standpoint. So, I think we ended up in a good place there. But as that work, and obviously there's still companies today that we work with on a regular basis to figure out what needs to be in a food safety plan. So we're very much still involved in the technical side of it. Some of my peers, Dr. Rolando Gonzalez and Cameron Prince, who is vice president of operations at CFIA in Canada, and he worked pretty closely on developing the Safe Food for Canadians Act when he was still in the government there. So they had done some early work, and Rolando was part of the GFSI working group that came up with that GFSI white paper that defines kind of the dimensions of food safety culture. And so, we've been fortunate to have, different members of our group involved at different points in time in the process, and thinking about, what does this mean? How are we going to define, how's the industry going to think about and define food safety culture? And certainly there's a lot of thought leaders out there in this space right now, thankfully, because I think there's a lot of work to be done as we kind of coalesce around this common set of concepts and language. So, that is sort of was our foray. Then this global pandemic happened, and that kind of refocused people for a little while. Although I think, coming out of COVID and the pandemic, I think it really emphasized for me, the importance of the underpinnings of food safety culture. So you've got, these technical food safety management systems in place, but what we've seen is that, if it's a group of people that really define the culture within a group or an organization, if half or 75% or 100% of those people leave within a year, in a food manufacturing facility, it's really hard to build consistent culture in that kind of space. And then as food companies, we have to be very conscious of the culture that we're essentially rebuilding or reestablishing in those spaces. So, like everything that was disrupted with the pandemic, I think, food safety culture in particular, was in some ways hard hit, because you had such an exodus from the food manufacturing, or food across the board. That could be retail. So, I think it speaks to the importance of really coming back to this topic. And I think, I don't want to say getting it right, because that implies that there's a wrong way to do it, but I think there are more right ways, to think about
more
approaching.
effective ways.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. I think like you described, right? Like you have to be intentional on what it looks like. Otherwise, it will be completely not what you think
Right.
it could or should be, perhaps.
Yeah. And when we talk about culture, right, that's that people, Jill and I, we talk about all the time this Mercer report that they put out that was called Inside Employees' Mind, their 2022 version. And they talked about how employees' needs are changing.
Mhm.
And so when we think about culture, and this change is, after COVID. So exactly what you're talking about, Ben, is like with people leaving the industry and now new people are coming in, or we're trying to recruit new people. Like even those people, their needs are different than they were, 3 years ago or 4 years ago pre-COVID. And so we have to think about how are we going to shift what we're doing to incorporate those people into our culture and to not ultimately either have our culture suffer if we were at a place that we were building right in the right direction, or that we can continue to build in the right direction if that's what your organization was doing. And so we have to, like you said, culture is always shifting because people are going in and out, people are getting promoted, people are, like any type of movement might impact culture. And so it's important for people to understand that like what your employees are even needing from your organization has changed in these last 5 years. And so making sure that that is incorporated into what you're looking at from your culture, which might be different than 2019.
Yeah, which is a really good lead in because, Ben, when you shared with us the first time talking about food safety climate, because I think it's something I heard before, but I thought people were probably really just talking about culture. Just with a different term, because right, once again, people are still searching for what does this mean, feel, look like for them. And after you sat down and really talked through this and we had some more conversation around it, it was one of these aha moments of like, yes.
Yeah.
It was really compelling to think about these really two distinct aspects. And I'm hoping you'll talk a little bit about that. Like, how is food safety culture that keeps hitting all the headlines and, real talk and everything else? How is that different than food safety climate? And why is food safety climate important to understand?
Yeah. And this, I mean, again, I'll kind of draw some parallels to my experience in public health. I would have, well, whatever. As undergraduates, many people that come to public health were originally going to be doctors, right? Like that's what I want to be. I want to be, an undergrad. I'm going to med school, and I think I had the opportunity to go and shadow physicians and, have opportunities. And by the time I was a senior in my undergrad, I was like, I'm not going to med school. It's not really my jam. But instead, I looked at public health and epidemiology as sort of an adjacent field. And, when we think about epidemiology, it's the study of disease within populations. And so there are some analogies that I draw from kind of culture versus climate. Culture is kind of that population level look at where is an organization. And climate is really kind of like, it's the individual. So if we think about, medicine and being a physician, I'm working with and treating the individual. When we're trying to assess climate, we're trying to understand where an individual sits relative to their beliefs and feelings about, or their attitudes about kind of the organization and the space that they're in. And we can look collectively at how individuals respond as part of assessment to get a gauge or to get kind of a better sense of what we think the climate is. But in that case, we're kind of measuring climate as a proxy or as an indirect indicator of the culture overall. And there are other things that go into culture, right? Like we talked about the food safety management system. We talked about, we haven't talked about like outcomes. And that's an area where I think the literature is a little thin right now. And I think we're going to see more work in that space because I'll risk a tangent here for a second, but we have a feeling, we have a sense that if we get food safety culture right, that we're getting the outcomes correct, that it's having a positive effect on food safety overall. I think that's intuitive, and that's why would we be doing it otherwise. And yet there's not a lot of literature at this point that shows us that that's true either. So, um, I think, again, intuitively it makes sense, but I think we need to do a better job of showing that there are also, positive microbiological or thing, however we decide to measure outcomes. And that's the tricky part is
Yeah.
measuring prevention has always been difficult. Like,
Right.
like I can tell you coming out of, field of public health, like trying to pitch and say, well, if we just do this, bad things won't happen. But I can't tell you what didn't happen, and,
Right.
Right. Public health policy, and we've seen this with COVID, tends to be reactionary, right? Like
Yeah.
we throw the kitchen sink at things when things are wrong, and then when they're not wrong anymore, it's like, did we have
Right. Yeah.
I don't remember, so it's
Yeah.
and that's a little bit of the struggle that we face just in terms of, culture and climate too, right? Like culture has to become a practice, really to be effective and something that you're not necessarily consciously thinking about. It's things you build it, you create those systems that support it, but and you do have to talk about it, but I think it's also not something that, I can't just go to decide to be, a great basketball player. Like I have to practice at it,
Yeah.
like, and so I think that's kind of the key piece. Sorry, I'll come back from my tangent, but so, culture is kind of that long-term group shared set of beliefs, behaviors, and assumptions. And climate is really kind of this temporary, but the academic definition is kind of this temporary construct that exists at the individual level, and it relates to perceptions and attitudes of an individual and how those perceptions and attitudes influence others in the organization and how others adhere to those food safety management systems. So in real practical terms, like if I, drop a piece of food on the floor and put it back up on the production line, like that's an individual behavior. What somebody else chooses to do or say about that is a reflection of the culture within that organization if they see me do it, right? So is that a tolerated behavior? Is somebody like, whatever, I don't want to be here today, so sorry. I'm like, I don't know what events I'm not going to do anything about, so it's how did I feel today? How do I feel about the organization? Do I feel like I have the resources that I need to be successful? Do I feel like somebody cares that I'm here? Do I understand even that dropping something on the floor and putting it back on the line is an issue? Maybe I do, maybe I don't. So, I think it's starting to try to get into understanding both at the individual and the kind of collective level, all of those elements that then give us a sense of sort of where an organization or even a group within an organization or even a work unit within a restaurant or retail food store or food processing plant sits. Because you can, dial that lens of measurement like in very closely, pull it back. Really depends on kind of the question you're asking. So
let's talk a little bit about measurement as you define food safety culture versus food safety climate. How are people currently measuring and assessing those things?
Yeah, I mean, I think to do assessment well, you have to look at a variety of things and take a variety of approaches. I think I'll editorialize a little here. I've seen that there's a tendency as some of these things get incorporated within, kind of food safety standards to say, we're going to survey people, once, twice, or, once a year, once every 2 years, and that's our food safety culture. Like, we're just going to look at those survey results. And if we're doing well, then great. And if we're not doing so well, we'll figure it out. So
we'll have a pizza party. Oh, sorry. That's my pet peeve.
Yeah. But and I think, again, if we're kind of coming together around this common set of language and, creating some literacy within the industry that food safety culture is important, that's good. Again, I'm not going to say you can do it wrong, but I think, again, you can do it more right? So it's like surveys are useful in terms of providing sort of one leg of kind of a three-legged stool. So I'm going to go back in my public health days, to talk about three-legged stools. Like we need these different things to support public health overall. I think the same is true with trying to assess food safety culture. So survey is a tool, it allows people to provide typically anonymous feedback, and it allows you to quantify that feedback in a way that can be useful. So it does start to speak to some of those important things that you measure as part of trying to assess the food safety climate within, a company, a plant, a work group in a plant, whatever. I think the other two pieces that matter are looking at kind of the maturity and competency of those food safety management systems. You have a great culture and have no systems. It's like, I love this place. Nobody ever tells me what to do. Like,
that's the food safety and food safety culture, right? Like you have to have the food safety and you have to have the culture for it to work.
Yeah, exactly. So, it's the old, Deming quote, a bad process will be, good people every time, right? So you still have to have good processes, and, looking at those systems, looking at those outcomes. I think really one of the hard things to do, and, if people want to put in comments, this would be something I'm always curious about, is like, do you have food safety measures? Because, if we're starting to think about outcomes, like what are those specific measures that you're looking at? And a lot of times people go to complaints, but the thing I don't like about complaints is it's reactive. It's like, well, something bad happened, right? So like, and it's a good indicator of like when bad things happen and allows you to go back and do corrective actions. But, are there other indicators that you can look at that are more preventive? Again, it's hard to measure what didn't happen, but there are ways to start to think about that. So one of the things that I like to have people think about is, when I have identified an issue, did I conduct a root cause analysis, and how many of those root cause analysis actually identified a source, and then did I take the corrective action? So you can start to quantify that. It's more work, right? Because you have to then go through and say like, did I do it? Did I find it? Did I fix it?
Yeah.
But starting to quantify those kind of things can be useful, to demonstrate that, one, that your systems work, but two, that you're devoting the time to actually do it. And, at the end of the day, that's really kind of what the way that the regulation is written anyways. I mean, that's the expectation. If I want to be compliant with, FDA or active managerial control within the food code or whatever, like that's how I should be looking at it. So, and then kind of that third piece is more this sort of semi quantitative or qualitative kind of interviewing approach. Like sit down with people. That can be in a focus group setting, that can be one-on-one interviewing, and really walking through a semi-structured series of questions that, and that's really valuable, especially if you're talking to people that are outside of kind of the traditional food safety quality realm. I mean, one thing that we love to do is sit down with people in HR and maintenance and IT, finance, because you really get a good sense of, one, do they understand sort of the fundamentals of food safety, but two, how prevalent is food safety just as part of their day-to-day work? Is it kind of an afterthought, and like if something's a problem, then we worry about it? Or is it, front and center in terms of resource and capital prioritization within an operation? So to me, to do it well, you have to kind of wrap your arms around sort of all of those things. And, it takes time and it's work, but I think you get a more holistic look at kind of what that culture is starting. You start to be able to quantify that culture in terms of maturity better when you're kind of integrating those multiple data sources.
Yeah, which I think makes sense.
Yeah, I think when we think about assessments, I always like compare it to like turning an aircraft carrier, right? It doesn't happen right away, and unless there is some major, hurricane or something that happens, for the most part, like that carrier is going to be fine. And I think when we think about assessments, we're battling like the large numbers that are typically going into it, and then that can often be where then we're at the mercy of things like central limit theorem. So things happen to, right, kind of all come into one space, which it's still a gauge of where we're at, but yet we miss, I think, like you said, it's so high level, but we miss some of the details that are the things that are driving where people are at, what they're feeling, and more of the outcomes that we see.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I love the question about like what people measure. Like I would love for people to be like, here's what we are actually measuring, like
Yeah.
our KPIs or ones that we wish we would be measuring.
Yeah.
That's another pet peeve of mine.
Well, I think sometimes too, when we think about KPIs, we are trying to search for these common ones that everyone's using, right? Like we want to like complaints, right? Or whether or not we pass our audit, or like these are things that we track and should track, right? Like we should not track those things. But when you really talk about culture and even climate, understanding, it's important to understand what's important for your culture right now and your climate right now, because it's so different, and it might even be different across facilities on what is it that you need to focus on with your people to move food safety culture forward. I was talking to someone about KPIs, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was like, maybe you need to measure if yes, you have it, or no, you don't. Versus like, I'm looking for a number that's going to come up to 4.61, you know? And they were like, oh, I never thought about like it just being a yes or no. And that's a KPI. It doesn't have to be complex, right? It doesn't have to be one of the ones that we always happen to measure, because it's really about your people and your food safety systems, right? And where they are today and where you want to get them to tomorrow. And I think sometimes we forget about that as we're trying to find these common measurements across the industry, is that it really is unique to the people that you have, which is exactly what you're saying, Ben. That's hard work. That's more work than saying we're going to track complaints and audit results, right? And how many times we do a GMP walkthrough, you know, like that's harder to kind of dig into. Okay, where are we at today, and where do we want to go to tomorrow, and what KPIs do we want to measure to get us there?
Yeah, I think it's sometimes that confusing part of what we focus on. So, for example, coming from USDA land, there was once a group that wanted to do KPIs of like how many NRs did we have, like nonconformance, right, from USDA. And the part is right, like that was, we all know that's not the driver. Like that is not driving the food safety practices we want. And I think sometimes we get caught up, like you said, picking something that seems common or that people will recognize, when really Ben used a great example. What is actually a key performance indicator is doing the root cause to prevent all those things, and how we're doing that. And I think sometimes it challenges us to flip that script to say, I can still measure and monitor how many NRs we have, but my KPI that's driving what I do and dictating work and resources is this other thing.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes those get flipped.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know, I know you've done a lot of work in this space too, but it's like really getting down to what's important for us to measure versus the things that seem to be more acceptable or more aligned, or because we've always done it that way.
Yeah.
Or just easier because we have hard data on that. Like, and that's,
right.
You know,
yeah, I can run a report out of a database and it tells me, it calculates that number versus, oh, I actually have to sit with that.
Have conversations, right?
And it's not that all those measures of food safety systems aren't important. Again, that is a measure of culture to some extent, right? You know, but is that, and it could be still, you know, a KPI. It's not to throw it out, you know, baby bathwater, like,
right.
But are there other things that you can look at that you have more control over, you know, because really, again, it kind of goes back to that climate culture discussion. It's like, what do I own, and what are the choices that I'm making within, you know, the 24 hours I have within a day, right? Sort of what are those habits that I've established, or that the organization allows me to do too, right? You know, I think that's the other piece, you know, and I think that gets into, we hear a lot about, you know, leadership commitment in food safety culture, and it's absolutely important, right? You know, I think I've, you know, been in a huge number of companies, over the last 5 years, and you can tell, when you walk into a company that has strong leadership commitment from a food safety standpoint because they've invested in those programs, and at the same time, not everybody's there.
Yeah.
But I think there are things that, even absent, really strong leadership support that, people can do kind of within the realm of their own sphere of influence, right? So
Yeah.
I'm sure there, are probably people joining us today that are, in supervisory or management roles, that are responsible for food safety management systems and programs. And I think, that's one thing that really kind of, intrigues me about your work is that, I know you work with that level of professional to think about ways to develop skills and habits that, empower them and allow them to essentially be better resources to their employees and think about, okay, here's the tools that we have. Like we might not have every single tool we want, but with what we have, what can we do? And then how do we tell that story to get more tools? So, I mean, I think so much of it, in my own management experience, like it really does depend on who that kind of frontline supervisor is and the approach that they take, because they set really the culture within that work group about what's good, what's not good, what are we going to do, how do we show up, how do we ask questions. So
Yeah. And Ben, to your point, what we see is that those are the people that get the least development, right? And they're the most impactful to culture, not just food safety culture, but culture in general. But they get the least leadership development support, even though we should see more leadership development support there, so that they would know how to be those leaders, because they're the true executors of culture. I like to think about it that our frontline workers and supervisors, they're the ones that can truly influence what the culture of that facility is. And then once you kind of get to your middle managers, they're the ones that's doing that driving, right? They're the ones that's translating some strategy work, right? May even have some of their own strategy work for that facility, and they're driving it through others, right? So that's the leadership, that skills that they need to be able to drive that culture. As senior leadership is really thinking about what direction are we going into, right? Because they're looking even farther down the road. But what we see is we almost see a flip where, if you make it right to the director level, then you might start getting even more leadership development there. But you haven't gotten any of that as you've tried to lead at other parts of the organization. And we see that culture struggles because of that, because we're not giving them those leadership skills that they need to build that culture and sustain that culture.
Well, and part of that, I think Mercer, we often go back to that report, but I think it really positions it well because of the shift in how we actually work. And right, I'm in the generation where, right, you're supposed to come in, you do your time, you get the experience, and as you move up, you get rewarded, right? You get more development or you get more expertise, sponsored by the organization. And really that's kind of like, that's the old way of doing things. And so, how to help organizations see that, right? When people come in, right, they're looking to make an impact, have purpose, really do good work there, but they're also not going to wait 10 years to have leadership development.
No.
Like they want to come in, and if I'm a supervisor, like I get really good support now. If I'm a middle manager, even working at corporate, like how do I more effectively be, right? We're in the middle, but how do I more effectively influence up and across and even down so that we can have more success?
Wow.
And that's what I really love about the work or the partnership that we're doing together with TAG and Catalyst, to say, right, like we can get this, a better picture or better understanding of culture and climate through, these really unique ways that TAG's approaching that. But then it's also about kind of looking at how we move that differently.
Yeah.
Because no matter how many times we measure culture, if we're not really willing to lead differently and be in this space together differently of how we do things, we could keep measuring, every week, every year, and our results probably will not shift.
Yeah. Or go down, right? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, because it'll just keep telling us where we are, right? Whether or not that's good, bad, or it's going down, right? The results will tell you that, right? As you're collecting them. And I think we're kind of stepping into that space of like, what happens after assessment, right?
Yeah.
Like what happens after you measure, because now you have these tools, maybe you've aligned on what your KPI should be. You're doing your assessments at a frequency. Really the next steps after that is, how do I equip my people to take care of their people, right? And directly leading that team, or they're indirectly leading that team. How do I equip my people to do what they need to do to protect the well-being of their people, to bring their whole self to work, to do all the things that impact culture, from that squishy part too, as well as that technical part.
Mm-hmm. And in a very intentional way.
Yeah.
So I love how this cycle works together, so that as organizations think about, how do we really move the needle to get to that next spot? And I love that this is the way to do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
By the things that we offer together to support them.
Yeah. And, if there's one thing that hopefully there's many different things that you have taken away from Real Talk today. But one thing that stands out in my mind is that it takes work. It's not enough to do an assessment, have a celebration, right? Or even, put together something that's low effort, right? And hope that the measurement is going to change, right? It takes work. Food safety culture takes work and resources and time and, yes, money, right, to do, which I don't know, maybe we're preaching to the choir, because, many of us are sitting in the space of trying to influence our organization to do things to support food safety culture. But it's one of those things that's almost a reminder, right? Because we run into, there's one company I was talking with, and their assessment said that people felt like that they weren't recognized enough, like really around recognition and rewards. And so they decided to recognize one person once a quarter on their global food safety and quality meeting. And when you think about that, right, they want to be recognized more, but there's really no detail around how would they want to be recognized? What would they want to be recognized for? Is it a big enough impact if 4 additional people are being recognized a year in a 30,000 employee organization, right? Is 4 people enough? I don't know, maybe it is, but those conversations hadn't happened to really understand, is that going to move the dial when it comes to rewards and recognition? And maybe what they'll find is that it does, because people are like, yes, at least they're recognizing 4 people. Or maybe it doesn't, because the people that wrote it on their survey, they didn't get recognized. Right. So they didn't see that recognition, and therefore it hasn't moved for them. Or maybe they're even more frustrated this year, and instead of a 4, now they're at a 3. So now your results are going in a different direction, even though you've rolled out a new program. So that's even something to remember, is like, you have to do that extra work to understand your data, right? So you can put the right KPIs into place, the right programs into place, versus spinning your wheels, which we've run into those clients too, that are like spinning their wheels and trying to figure out, like, we do these assessments, what do we do next? Which I think is really special about the partnership that we have together, is that we have the assessment and what do you do next? So you can continue to look at your data each year and understand what is truly driving it.
Yeah. And I just dropped the link in the comments. So if you're listening and you're like, yep, I need to know more about that, because carrying the load of being responsible to improve food safety culture on your own, or even go collect that data somehow, or gosh, I have a pile of data. Now what do I do? How do I engage others? We're going to talk in more detail next week on the 9th about like what that can look like, and the type of support that can provide for you. So, register, save your seat. we'd love to have you and join in with us on that conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, looking forward to it. I guess, yeah, for for providing closing thoughts, and it's been a really good conversation. I think I would just reflect that a lot of the research that's been done kind of in the academic side around food safety cultures really kind of came from concepts that were developed 20, 25, 30 years ago around employee safety overall. And I think one of the challenges with food safety culture, and I'm glad that we call it that, and at the same time, I think it poses a challenge in the sense that it implies that it's the responsibility of, just the food safety quality people to worry about. And, I think if you go into organizations today and talk about employee safety, that's the responsibility of everybody, right? Like
Yeah.
we're not, it's not limited to just the safety guy or girl or woman or person, fill in the blank, but that everybody understands the importance of that. And I think in order for organizations to mature, it has to take that multidisciplinary approach to food safety culture. It's like we're making a food product or we're selling a food product, and one of the inherent characteristics of that product is that it's safe for our consumers. And that's something that transcends just food safety quality people. It requires really everybody to be on board. Anybody that's responsible for any aspect of making or selling food. So there's still a mindset shift that we have to kind of keep remembering there. And I think, and we're seeing that we're moving in that direction, but I don't think we're not fully there yet.
No. And I think safety culture, had to get there too, where if you look back 50 years ago or maybe a little bit farther, people looked at it as like, oh, it's a safety guy, or maybe they didn't even have a safety person there. And then that culture has shifted where it's everyone's responsibility to be a part of safety, right? And ensuring the safety of ourselves and others. And in industries that really focus on safety culture, like, my background is a chemical engineer. So a lot of my work in school was in refineries in the oil and gas industry. And if there's a safety incident there, right, like it could be really bad. So the safety cultures there, at the organization that I worked for was like top notch. And as I think about food safety culture, a lot of those concepts, right, applies. It's just for food safety versus safety, right? And just how often you talk about, in my case, how often we talked about safety, right? Am I in an organization that we're talking about food safety that often? And so there's some parallels there, and even some things like we can learn from, okay, how do we start talking about safety in this way? People culture, right? Which is probably not as old as safety culture, but people culture too. Like a lot of times people thought, oh, that's HR. HR is doing people culture, right? But now it's like, no, I'm a leader in an organization. I'm responsible for the people culture on my team and the people around me. And so food safety, we have to get there too.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's, once again, it's raising that awareness and that responsibility of everybody needing to be part of the community to make it successful.
Yeah.
And if we're not willing to step into that space, or we think it's somebody else's job to do that, we see the effects of that. And so the better we can create that community and have everybody be part, and that belonging and speaking up, all of those things come from being able to do that.
Yes.
So
this is like part one of a conversation, and we're excited about the webinar next week. Jill put in the link. You can find the link on all of our LinkedIn. So please connect with us. We would love to continue this conversation with you. And we're going to dive even deeper about food safety culture, food safety climate, and what you can do to advance yours.
Yep. But until next week or the webinar, we hope you have a great week, and we'll be back here, same time, same place for Real Talk Food Safety with Jill and Tia.
All right. And thank you, Ben, for being on the show.
Thank you so much.
We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
All right. We'll see everyone later. Have a great week.